Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Luke Beckman analyzes corn and soybean markets. Kevin Korus updates us on soybean disease issues. Nathan Mueller discusses selecting soybean seed varieties from the 2015 growing season. And Tina Barrett talks about 2014 farm incomes in Nebraska. Luke Beckman from Central Valley Ag is our marketing analyst this week. The USDA is scheduled to release its September crop report Thursday morning at 11 a.m. Central Time. In its previous estimate, the agency projected record corn and soybean crops, and conditions since then have remained favorable. In fact, according to the USDA's weighting scale, the current U.S. soybean condition index isn't just remarkable since it's this late in the season. It's noteworthy because it's the third best rating at any point in the growing season over the last 20 years. We talked with Luke Wednesday afternoon at CVA's location in Humphrey and began by asking about current crop conditions.
Well, Jeff, on Monday, USDA looking at corn, overall good to excellent ratings, actually up a point. You know, that's counter-seasonal to what we would anticipate, especially for this August time period. So crops still very much in good shape. It's kind of becoming old news at this point. Corn is probably more about a progress problem more so than conditions. So, you know, corn denting is behind average in pretty much every single state, you know, except for Illinois. So definitely going to be a conversation for the market in the coming weeks.
Soybeans condition holding in there as well, though?
Yeah, soybean conditions up as well, counter-seasonal to what we would anticipate. You know, progress-wise, they're on pace. Beans, it's a photo period plant determined by day length. So they're going to be, you know, pretty close to where they should be progress-wise.
Do we have any harvest numbers coming out from the south yet?
Harvest numbers out of the south have been very good. You talk about Delta soybeans have been excellent. Yields well above where they should be for them. Corn yields very much the same way. So if the south is any indication of what's going to happen as they work their way north, you know, we're going to have a big crop.
Yeah, and the USDA expects a record crop in both, and they'll update those numbers next week. But since there is going to be big crops in both corn and soybeans, which market do you think is better equipped to handle the supply that we're going to see after harvest?
It's a good question, Jeff, because, you know, big crops for both. You know, you think about where do our bushels go? You know, the corn market, we're positioned so much better in this country to handle that because we have ethanol stated right here. So ethanol and feed use are our two biggest buckets that consume corn. You talk about the soybean market, and we export, you know, a third of our soybeans, you know, to other countries. And so what do we have to rely on to get that done? The rail and barge freight. So it's a major problem. Everybody kind of knows that. Will the beans get shipped? Yeah, they will, but what does it mean? It backs up into weaker basis values at harvest.
Now, we know soybean exports have been good. Describe to me how good they've been and for how long they might be able to help this soybean market before a buyer would go to South America.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of tis the season for soybean export sales. They've been very active, you know, over the past several weeks, past month, and that'll continue. The pace has actually been ahead of last year's record pace. So soybean export sales, very, very good. You're going to have Brazil. It's going to compete with us like always. So, you know, soybean exports can be there, but it's all about supply outpacing the increase in demand this year, and that's what's leading us to a pretty sizable carryout in the soybeans.
Longer term, what's your price forecast for soybeans?
You know, soybeans, if you go back to carryout levels that we expect this year, you're going to go back to 2006, and I hate to even say it, but you definitely have single-digit soybeans. So there's not a lot of friendly people out there on the price of soybeans. So we'd anticipate that the funds are going to push this thing. We're breaking support plans today. $10 is the next target, and we'd anticipate that it's going to go through that as well.
You mentioned the funds on soybeans. Where are they on corn?
You're talking about corn funds, Jeff. They have not pushed this market lower. They've gotten out, but they haven't pushed it lower. They're probably getting into that position here, breaking support today as well. So corn, probably is going to be a victim of that a little bit here in the coming weeks.
There seems to be no incentive to sell corn right now, and there's probably a lot in storage as well. Maybe we'll see some numbers on that next week too. But what could that do once you get a record harvest plus a lot of storage? Could we have a glut in the market at some point?
Yeah, it's similar to last year, at least locally for producers in Nebraska. You'll see bushels on the ground. I'm sure there's a lot of storage going up. So there'll be a lot of bushels around for sure. You would think that it would manifest itself in weaker basis values, but you talk about this summer, the stuff's just not for sale. Guys have the bin doors locked. We'd anticipate that's going to happen again as soon as harvest is over. So you start talking December on out, you could see opportunities for basis. So we're going to anticipate that basis will show us opportunities this year for the simple fact that guys don't want to sell it at these prices.
Could there be a premium to getting it to the market right away if it's dry?
Absolutely. You go back to 2009, we're going to have a lot of bushels, we know that, but it's all going to be stacked behind a dryer. So we're going to have those premiums for dry bushels. We'd certainly anticipate that. So that'll be a little bit of a salvation for a few producers.
And how does basis move on soybeans around harvest?
Soybeans, that go back to that rail comment. A lot of those beans are going to have to move early. Our export program is front-loaded. Everybody kind of knows that. So again, bushels have to move. How do they get moved? You have to buy the expensive freight. It gets reflected in weaker basis values on soybeans. Next
week we get the September crop report. I misspoke earlier. The grain stocks report isn't until later in the month, but what do you expect next week?
Next week USDA is probably going to continue to stair-step yield estimates up. Biggest one probably expected October, November. So this market feels like a 175 yield number for corn. Don't think the USDA will go there next week, probably a low 170s, 71, 72, but a lot of private estimates this week pegging 174, 175s. Soybeans, we'd certainly anticipate the same thing. Going to add a couple bushels to that yield number from the private market. You probably see a bushel increase from the USDA next week.
Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will join us to analyze the USDA's September crop report. Nebraska soybean farmers have been ahead of the curve since spring. The state was the first to finish its soybean planting, and that crop's progression continues. Among the top 18 soybean producing states, Nebraska, as of the latest progress report, was the only with 100% of soybean setting pods. Overall, the crop is rated 72% good to excellent, with 5% dropping leaves. But there could be problems within those fields. Korus from UNL's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic explains what you can be scouting for in your fields.
There's 4 main prevalent diseases that are still going on throughout the state. When you look at the field from a distance, unfortunately, all of these diseases may look the same, as they have a patchy distribution throughout the field. So you'll find a spot or a patch of dying plants, and it may be from these 4 diseases, which are sudden death syndrome, brown stem rot, Phytophthora root and stem rot, and Sclerotinia white mold. Now, Sclerotinia is going to be confined mostly to the northern part of the state. We don't see that necessarily across the state, although we have had weather conditions this year that have made it conducive for infection on the eastern side of the state. Now, whether it'll show up there or not, I don't know. But Sclerotinia white mold, that particular fungus that causes that disease, infects through the flowers. And we had a lot of cool, wet weather during flowering this year, so that had opened up the plants for a lot of infection. With Sclerotinia, you don't start seeing the symptoms sometime until a little bit later on in the season, and you'll notice some wilting and some dieback, and maybe some white fuzzy mycelium at the base of the plants. The other one is Phytophthora root and stem rot. This one's maybe a little bit easier to distinguish from the rest because it will turn the root system, the base of the stem, and sometimes even the lower stems a dark color on the outside of the plant. So you'll be able to see this discoloration of the outside in the crown, and once you split that stem, you'll see it kind of a discoloration on the vascular tissue as well. Sudden death syndrome is also in the state. I think we all know what the the leaf symptoms can look like. The veins remain green, and you get this interveinal firing and chlorosis. With sudden death syndrome, as that disease progresses, the leaves will actually fall off the petiole, which is that little stem that connects the soybean to the big stem. So you'll see these plants with all these little stems, but no leaves. So that could be an indication of sudden death syndrome. Again, we've just had the perfect weather for these kinds of diseases. Sudden death is caused by fusarium, which also enjoys this cool, wet weather condition. And then finally, we have brown stem rot. And brown stem rot and sudden death syndrome, when you just look at the outside of the plant, or even when you step back and look at the field in general, they look quite a bit alike. And it's not until you start splitting that stem open to where you can see the differences. And they're not always super clear. So again, submission to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic can sometimes be key for these identifications. Management is all the same for these diseases. And it starts with genetic resistance. So it is important to identify which pathogen you have so that you can select a variety accordingly. You know, it's important to do these, to scout your fields now while the plants are still growing and the diseases are still differentiable. Once the plant starts to die or is completely dead, it becomes very difficult to get a diagnosis. So I would continue scouting up until the plants are completely dried down and dead.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to information on submitting samples to UNL's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic. For more information on identifying and managing soybean diseases, you can watch our interview with Lauren Giesler from the August 22nd episode of Market Journal. You've heard in our interviews on soybean diseases the importance of seed selection. While the 2014 crop is still in the field, UNL Extension educator Nathan Mueller says farmers can already be thinking about variety selection for the 2015 season. In a soybean field near Fremont Wednesday, we talked with Nathan about what to look for in a variety and why you might want to start looking now.
The main thing now is to capture those early seed discounts, and the nice thing about doing that, we can go ahead and capture those early discounts, select a few varieties, and we'll talk about what to select for. And then once harvest comes out and we actually have yield data to look at, you can make some substitutions. Your seed company is going to be more than willing to keep your business and make some substitutions as long as that variety is available that you want to substitute out.
It's not a big deal that you don't have yield data yet.
No, because what we can do, we can select, let's say, 2 or 3 varieties for our farm that, historically have done well with the company, or, they have their own company data that they're looking at too to help make recommendations for you. They want to see you succeed. And then you can actually look at third-party yield trials that come out, whether it's First or University of Nebraska, and then look at the data. Okay, maybe one of these 3 didn't perform like we thought. Let's substitute it out with something else. Now, the only thing that comes into play there is the fact that some varieties might be a little harder to get, some new ones. So if you really want to try those, it might be important to pick those out now and drop them and pick one up. Maybe that's a little bit easier to get. Seed supply looks to be good this year for most varieties.
Let's talk about specifically selecting a variety. What should you look for if you've had problems with SDS or SCN?
Yep.
Looking at resistance in those plants.
Sure. The main thing to manage SCN and sudden death syndrome is generally variety selection. Now there's some new things coming on the line in terms of seed treatments for both of those. But still, if you have a history of SDS, it's important to make a note what field, what it was 2 years ago, what did you plant for a variety, how did it perform, what was the rating, and go ahead and pick that. If that's your biggest yield limiting factor is a disease or cyst, you want to pick on that. But let's just talk about yield, for example. We know in third-party trials, and these are varieties that companies freely submit, there can be, let's say in first trials or adjacent states where we have a lot of varieties, there can be a 15 bushel difference between the best performing and the worst performing. Try finding any other management practice that can give you up to a 15 bushel swing. Are you going to get that 15 bushel swing? If you were to put all these varieties in a hat and pick out, you're probably not likely going to pick the best and the worst, right? But even if you're middle line, 8 bushels at $10 a bushel, that's $80 an acre. There's a lot of farmers that want to figure out how to make an extra $80 an acre this next year.
And I've heard researchers talk about the improvements that seed companies have made. You don't take as much of a penalty for selecting something, for instance, that has an SCN resistance to it or a tolerance to it.
No, and a lot of things when it comes to SCN, they've worked out that plant introduction for SCN the most common. So now there's not a yield drag in most of those varieties. SDS, I've never really heard of any yield specific drag with looking or selecting for SDS.
What if you've had lodging problems in some of your fields?
Yeah, so lodging problem, like this field behind us, you can see there's a little bit of lodging. If you're in an area where you have history of tall beans or lodging, or you have a manured field, whether it's through biosolids or cattle manure or hog manure. Those are environments where you tend to get a lot of vegetative growth, and if soybeans lodge, before harvest, that limits photosynthesis. You tend to have more disease issues, and then obviously a problem come harvest. So those are things to look for, the standability rating of the variety, and most companies give that type of either lodging or standability score.
You mentioned earlier that you want to select maybe 2 or 3 varieties. What's the benefit of doing that?
Yeah, the main thing is just risk management. So same as corn hybrids, just spreading out your maturity. So if we have, like we did in 2013, a really hot period for maybe a week or two, that can really catch some maturity. So if you're, let's say, at a 3.4 and you also had a 2.8, kind of the range of maturities in this region, that can make a big difference. And I saw some pretty big yield differences previous when I was working further north, that it made up to a 7 bushel difference based on maturity and when that weather period hit during seed fill.
Seems like the bottom line here is that you want producers to take a good look at what they're doing because it matters.
Yeah, it really does. Out of any other management factor that we do, it's a routine management decision. We select seed every year, and those are the things that we need to do better at when margins get tight. The things that we do every year, how can we do those things better? And again, if you're looking at an 8 bushel difference and the cost of those 2 varieties is 2 bushel difference in a bag, it's really a no-brainer just to spend more time. Don't spend an hour. Do you need to spend 20 hours? No. But somewhere in the middle. And utilize your resources. Utilize the knowledge of your seed dealer. Utilize the knowledge that we have in terms of third-party data and looking at some other considerations in variety selection.
We'll link to more resources on soybean selection on the Market Journal website. At the Maddox Cattle Company near Juanita, the cow herd is designed for low input and low labor. The operation is featured in the September issue of Nebraska Farmer. John Maddox says the cows are a composite of 5 breeds and well suited for the ranch's environment and production system. Maddox says he believes it's economically better to focus on the cow side first, emphasizing a low input, low labor cow that raises a calf every year. He says that trumps focusing on high production traits. You can read more about the Maddox Cattle Company in the September Nebraska Farmer. Earlier this week, we talked with Tina Barrett from Nebraska Farm Business. As we mentioned last week, the USDA is expecting a shift in profits this year between livestock producers and crop growers. The agency expects livestock receipts to increase by more than 15%, while forecasting a drop in crop receipts of 7%. Overall, the USDA is projecting net farm income at $113.2 billion, down about 14% from last year. Tina talked with us Thursday about the sales tax exemption for ag repair parts, cash rental rates, and if she was expecting the same divergence in profits between the state's livestock producers and corn and soybean growers.
We do. We see that definitely coming, and partly because we have a very heavy crop influence in at least the producers that we work with. We certainly expect incomes to be down.
Let's talk about livestock producers, specifically beef producers who have done really well over the last few months, and cow-calf producers will also do well. What kind of tax things does that, and then disaster payments, do those bring into play?
Right. So the cow-calf, the livestock guys in general are dealing with what the crop guys have dealt with for the last 5 years, and the tide has finally shifted, and they're getting their turn. But it's going to mean that tax time is going to be a little more painful than it's been in the past. And the last month or so, we've been hearing that there's been a lot of disaster payments being received from 12, 13, and 14 from some of the drought issues that they had. And the problem with that is a cash basis taxpayers, that's all taxable this year as well. So so they're dealing with these great prices and income that should have maybe been received in the last couple of years. And so they're going to have a lot to deal with. And certainly things like income averaging is going to help, but they better be prepared for some higher tax bills, which is a good thing in the end.
Flip side of that, the crop producer is probably not looking at that high of incomes, especially compared to normal this year.
Right. For what they've been experiencing the last 5 years, this is going to feel a little different. It's going to feel a little better at tax time, but again, it's not a time to ignore tax planning or anything like that. And I have a lot of producers who aren't wanting to let go of that grain at these prices, and I understand that, but it's also really expensive to create a loss on your tax return for the lost things that you could take in. And so it's really important to make sure they get into that tax preparer and take a look at that, even if they feel like they don't have a tax problem this year.
And Was a lot of profit carried over, a lot of revenue carried over as well?
I think, we've been seeing growing inventories over the last 5 years for the crop guys in huge ways. And so they may not see a huge difference, especially where at this point in time we don't have a high cost of or a depreciation expense from Congress yet. Keep saying that it's coming, that we're probably going to get it. But this will be the first year we don't have the ability to write off a large sum of money in capital purchases. And so between the two things, cash incomes might actually be, still pretty high this year for some crop guys.
2015 is obviously a question mark at this point, but do you expect costs to go down at all?
I haven't heard of any costs going down. I think, one that everybody needs to be aware of is cash rents, and especially those rents that have gone up rapidly over the last couple of years. I think both tenants and landlords need to take a pretty tough look at those and figure out what they're going to do, because, from a farming standpoint, the profit's just not there. From a landlord standpoint, though, their costs are going up because real estate taxes have certainly risen quite rapidly as well. And so, both parties need to be aware of how the other's sitting. But for both of them to be in their best place, each of them need to make some money. And so, sitting down and figuring out what the right number is going to be tough, but it's going to have to be something that's done.
You wrote a Cornhusker Economics article soon to be released on the sales tax exemption. Explain what that means.
Yeah, so the state legislature this year passed a bill that allowed repairs for farm equipment to be exempt from sales tax. It hasn't been that way in the past. Doesn't go into effect until October 1st. So we've got a little bit of time yet to continue to prepare for this. Basically what it means is any equipment that's used in the production of agriculture, whether that's cultivating and harvesting crops or producing animal products, any repairs on those equipment now will not have sales tax on them. As a producer, you're going to have to provide your vendor with a Form 13. You can get that from the state's website. It's pretty easy to get to. And once you give it to them, you can either do it on an annual basis or give them a blanket exemption that you have to revoke in writing. So most people will just give it to them once. They'll keep it on file. That's not necessarily everything that you use for farming. It's very specifically for cultivating and harvesting crops. So four-wheelers, even though they're used in your business, aren't exempt from sales tax, either when you purchase them or the repairs on them. So there's some things that are going to certainly have to be figured out in there.
Tina's Cornhusker Economics article on sales tax exemption can be found through a link on the Market Journal website. August was a wet month across many parts of Nebraska. The 7.54 inches that fell in Lincoln ranked in the top 10 in that month over the last 100 years. The latest U.S. Drought Monitor also shows good news for Nebraska as a whole. 85% of the state is in no drought classification. It's the largest percentage since March 6, 2012, and the second highest since August 30th, 2011. Now with a look at the weather for the coming week, here's UNL Extension state climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, we've seen a roller coaster in regards to temperatures. We entered the weekend with cool conditions, a little bit of warming toward the end of the weekend, only to see another front come through with some scattered thunderstorm activity as we got into the Labor Day period. Then, of course, we've seen the warming across western Nebraska. The cool air gave way to the warming conditions during the midweek period. Then we've seen that trough moving across the northern plains that brought some significant weather in terms of severe conditions and heavy precipitation for the Dakotas eastward into the central Great Lakes region. That front passed through us, touched off some scattered thunderstorm activity, and of course yesterday we had the residual moisture left over in the southern part of the state that brought more like what we would expect to see in the early fall. Cloudy, cool, damp conditions. Now, as we go through today, we expect a slight bump in temperatures compared to yesterday under sunny skies, but it's still going to be cool and well below normal. So if you are going to the Huskers game, I would suggest you take a jacket, especially if you're going to the pre-game festivities. Temperatures are likely to be confined to the 60s and will barely warm into the low 70s by the time the game is over. In regards to the features toward next week, what we are watching is some cold air showing signs of penetrating into the lower 48 states. The exact placement of that cold air remains to be a question, but it does appear that there will be some frost, at least in the northern plains, and the question will it make it down in through Minnesota and into portions of Iowa and clip northeast Nebraska. That's the big uncertainty. Right now, it looks like it's going to stay east of us. Be aware that that cold air could possibly impact portions of extreme northeastern Nebraska. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we have in terms of the forecast. In terms of the trough responsible for that cold air, it is now up in the Great Lakes region. So in the upper atmosphere, we're looking at more of a zonal flow, but at the surface, we still got the residual cold air on the backside of the surface low. So that will keep conditions cool today under primarily sunny skies and temperatures about 5 to upwards of 15 degrees below normal. The warmer conditions will be across western Nebraska, closer toward this ridge that is going to try to build in. So as we go into tomorrow, we'll see that that zonal flow maintains its consistency. There is some energy moving across the northern streams, and this looks like we could see some scattered shower activity develop over northern Nebraska during the afternoon hours, and some of that will start to move toward the east-southeast during the overnight hours. And as we get into Monday, we'll see that that moisture has the potential to hit eastern Nebraska. Western Nebraska looks to be fairly calm. Now as we go into Tuesday, and this will be the start of Husker harvest days, we see a trough trying to make its way into the northern plains. This is that cold air that will be coming in later in the week, and any activity will be right around the periphery of this area, so we're looking at maybe northern Nebraska as the best chance for activity during the afternoon hours. More importantly, as we go into Wednesday, this trough really swings fast, so we will be looking at cloudy conditions for most of the day, off and on shower activity. It won't be pleasant out there if you're going to Husker harvest day, but we are expecting to see some moisture and some very cool conditions. And as we get into Thursday, the more important reinforcing shot of cold air starts to make its way into the northern plains. The models are up in the air in regards to moisture on Thursday. Right now I'm going to keep it dry, but there is some models saying that we may see some residual moisture carry through. And then on Friday, this low deepens over the Great Lakes and starts to pull this cold air down, so we could see some shower activity in eastern Nebraska. In terms of the temperature forecast, you can see it's cool this weekend, and then we start to warm up during the middle of the week, and then a sharp cool down toward the end of next week. 8 to 14 day forecast, which includes next Thursday, the following Tuesday, continues the cooler than normal conditions, and in terms of precipitation, it looks like most of the heavy moisture shifts to our east.
Thanks, Al. Today's information on corn and soybean markets, soybean diseases, 2014 Nebraska Farm Incomes, and selecting soybean varieties can be found on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. Next week, we'll report from Husker Harvest Days near Grand Island. If you're attending the show, you can find the Market Journal tent located near the Nebraska building on 3rd Street. Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will analyze corn and soybean markets after the USDA releases its September crop report. And Gary Zobeck will talk about managing the timing of soybean harvest to maximize yield. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.